All right, so today I want to discuss the idea of sensitivity consideration within the confines of mostly tabletop gaming, but also the wider games industry as well. Reason being, if we assume the current atmosphere of political correctness and sensitivity outrage to be a kind of social pendulum, if you will, I believe it's starting to slow down, maybe even swing back the opposite way. Tabletop fantasy gaming is a very easy place to start because it's been under fire recently from a number of different angles, and chief among them, racial sensitivity concerns. The most immediate example I can point to is from Wired magazine, publishing an article titled, quote, "D&D must grapple with the racism in fantasy, and getting rid of it will take a lot of work," end quote. This particular article goes in depth on origin demographics behind popular archetypes, like orcs, for example, or drow elves. It explains an origin quote for the aesthetic behind orcs in Lord of the Rings, which paints a picture of racially motivated foundations. And as a side note, being extremely familiar personally with Lord of the Rings, I can tell you right now, the assumption that this one descriptive quote from J.R.R. Tolkien, found in a letter many years ago, is indicative of the orcs' actual canonized lore is ridiculous. Orcs were, in actuality, good and moral beings who had been corrupted, tortured, and debased because Morgoth was incapable of creating life himself, only transforming it into something darker. In fact, Tolkien often grappled with the concept of redemption for the souls of these orcs, seeing as they had been magically tortured to become what they are now, having previously been a race of elves that fell prey to his darkness. There was no real solution ever transcribed, that I could find at least, but the origin of orcs in Lord of the Rings is not a racial stereotype. It is not a racial boundary of they who are lesser. It is rather a story of corruption by evil that was inflicted upon certain individuals. Now, that's not necessarily true for every other fantasy universe out there, but it should help showcase that just because you have an enemy in a fictional fantasy world, an enemy that lacks intellect or whose body is bent and broken, it does not de facto make it racism. All in all, this article is filled with incorrect or flat-out deceptive interpretations of why and how certain fantasy races exist in their current state. But that's not even the point right now, because the expectation that fantasy worlds be made to conform to our modern standards in a snapshot of time right now for sensitivity and consideration, it's completely unsustainable. Why do I say this? Well, one great example comes from RPG.net, and browsing this website for just a matter of minutes will make it abundantly clear that there is a particular demographic user base. That is completely fine, don't get me wrong. Communities like that have every conceivable right to exist, but it should be noted that this is a very left-leaning, social sensitivity-oriented community that wholeheartedly believes in that type of political correctness that I'm discussing in this video. Again, that's their right, it's totally fine. It's not even necessarily a bad thing to any noticeable degree, it's just the reality of this forum. That's important because on a specific thread by the user Mithril Maiden titled "Talking about Indigenous Peoples Without Colonialism," a very interesting exchange takes place. On page 11, and scattered throughout the precursor pages as well, we can see the following after lengthy discussions about the need for sensitivity readers. Quote, "Honestly, I'm kind of leaning towards stopping world building altogether at this point because, well, here's the problem," and then quoting a previous user post. Which is one of the major first things to do is do the research and get a sensitivity reader. As you said, it's not easy and it's messy, and there's no guarantees in the process, but it's better than not doing so. Continuing from Mithril Maiden, "This is fair, but doing the research is a ton of work, and sensitivity readers aren't or shouldn't be free. Sensitivity reading is a ton of emotional labor that you can't just expect people to do. And for me, D&D is supposed to be a hobby in my free time. I'm both a graduate student and a foreign language student. I have a ton of research I have to do in my day-to-day life, so if my D&D hobby also requires tons of research outside of areas of history I'm already broadly familiar with, that becomes a problem in that suddenly my hobby is work, and I already have too much work in my life. But if I don't do the research and want more diverse settings, and I do want more diverse settings, well, unresearched attempts at diversity are inherently going to be offensive." Lastly, so where it's at is I just don't have the energy to put the work in, and that means I need to not attempt to do this at all. It's biting off far, far more than I can hope to chew. End quote. Immediately under this, another user states in reference to "I don't have the energy," "If it helps, you're not alone in feeling this way." They literally said that verbatim. Keep in mind, this is a forum where the users, by and large, subscribe to the idea that sensitivity readers are necessary. They're absolutely imperative. That fictional worlds must be constructed in order to never offend anyone, and avoid the possibility of offense for everyone at all costs, even when that cost in terms of time, investment, and labor becomes untenable. The discussion that ensues after is littered with differing opinions on the subject, but a notable number of participants seem to understand the sentiment that this world building is a hobby that might not have any financial resources dumped into it, a hobby that this person is now feeling might require more work than would ever be sustainable if they need to jump through these consistent hoops. Effectively, the idea that you cannot ever offend anyone for any reason and need to do the research so that you don't, when that research involves deciphering sometimes literal gibberish, well, perhaps the pendulum is starting to swing back the opposite way, and people will begin to realize how unsustainable that really is. Below, we can see another message from a user that has participated on this message board since 2009 and sent over 7,000 messages in that time frame. Quote, if you are writing a much larger setting like Vampire the 1500s, I think that is a ludicrous demand. Think about how many at least partially oppressed groups there are in the world today whose oppression began or was ongoing in the 1500s. LGBTQ individuals, Jews, Central Asians, Roma, Native Americans, Africans, and Muslims all come to mind quickly, and those are huge categories that each merit many subgroups. We could easily throw in other groups like the Irish, Greeks, various Balkan ethnicities, pagans, and so forth as well. Even women could be added to the list. The notion that anybody could plausibly do any kind of deep research into and have a sensitivity reader for all of those groups is an impossible barrier. The only option becomes to severely limit how inclusive you are allowed to be. I think that, at some point, an honest effort to be respectful and inclusive and a willingness to apologize on causing offense has to be acceptable, or else you are barring many, many people from writing. End quote. That is effectively a message that has been absolutely shouted at those who preach sensitivity for years now, and it is one that we are starting to see replicated even in the most isolated of online echo chamber forums, where this kind of consideration is viewed as the imperative norm. Now, to me, at least, that's a very reassuring discovery, personally, because it demonstrates that the practical, reality-based creators in these online communities might be starting to see how this mindset is untenable. But to really drive home the point, I'll go even further with two more examples. First, we have to look at the gender pronoun section of TSER, or Trans Student Educational Resources. The graph displayed shows different uses of existing gender pronouns, and the goal here is not to mock or degrade anyone at all, okay? So just get that straight, everyone who's watching this. The goal is to showcase why the ability to realistically avoid offending anyone at any point for any reason is holistically impossible. It starts with she, her, hers, herself, moves on to he, him, his, himself, they, them, theirs, themself, and then sie, her, zer, hers, zers, herself, zerself, and the following example usage. This is gibberish, and the reason I say that is very, very precise. The her, hers, herself pronouns are phonetically identical. I mean, unless I'm mispronouncing them and it's here, here's, here, I don't know. They're phonetically identical to previous examples, and most importantly, it is explicitly stated at the top, please note that these are not the only pronouns, there are infinite pronouns, as new ones emerge in our language. Always ask someone for their pronouns. The Z line not only presents phonetic issues if one were to hear it in actual everyday conversation, but the subjective could refer to completely separate sets of objective, possessive, and reflexive uses. Example, if I were to proclaim that everyone must now call me she from now on, but then instead of she, her, hers, it was she, but then him or his, it's gibberish. Gibberish that does not follow existing grammatical rule sets, which have been codified over centuries. And one could absolutely make the argument, okay? So just bear with me here before people screech at me in the comments. One could make the argument, for sure, that this requires human beings to unlearn their existing standards of language in order to adapt. If you want to say that, that's fine. You have every right to believe that. But that process, even if it were to be widely accepted, which debatably it's not right now, would take decades, possibly longer. Bottom line, this creates a scenario in which offending someone somehow, some way, is all but assured, especially with an infinitely expanding list of pronouns that evolves by the day. However, we can demonstrate this even better with one final example. PETA. Now, yes, PETA is a group of absolutely insane people. If you don't know about how psychotic they really are, I will link another of my videos down below. PETA leadership have literally funded terrorist organizations. There have been examples of high crime, and their support campaigns are deranged at best, but that's just a different video. PETA activists are insane. That much is true. But in the context of sensitivity readers, these are the types of people who must be considered because they demand to be considered. These are the types of people who absolutely crave that consideration, and they seek to modify existing language in a way that pleases them. On the official Twitter page, we can see the following graphic, which claims that certain language perpetuates human supremacy and justifies oppression. Chicken, rat, snake, pig, that's an important one, keep that in mind, and sloth. The graphic proposes alternatives and seems to align itself with the idea that anyone who believes in equality and justice needs to realign their perspectives and their language. Now let's reference back to the original D&D article from Wired magazine. Quote, "Here is how Dungeons & Dragons describes the orc in the latest monster manual where all such demi-humans are relegated. Orcs are savage raiders and pillagers with stooped postures, low foreheads, and piggish faces." End quote. This particular article focuses on racism, but if we were to picture ourselves in a world where we must avoid offending anyone for any reason at any time, the fact that these orcs are likened to pigs, or animals ever, would be inexcusable. Going even further, playing off of the RPG.net forum post, in order to find these problems at all, we would have to hire sensitivity readers from presumably every conceivable demographic imaginable so that we could weed out those kinds of microaggressions or trigger words before publicizing and mass-producing our world or story, and, rightly so, it seems that people are starting to realize how psychotically impossible that actually is to do on a larger scale. The thing is, this is an isolated ecosystem. It's compartmentalized is what I mean. I've discussed the downstream ramifications of this sensitivity mindset before and how the absurdity is creeping into more areas of life with each passing day, but of all the existing entertainment mediums, tabletop gaming is quite possibly the most resilient. The truth is, these kinds of expectations can only go as far as the individual groups that contain members who care. And when those demands become so colossally overblown and tedious that they derail the entire game session, well, that person's not getting reinvited. What follows, and has probably been happening already for quite some time, is a stratification of the community. Those who demand sensitivity readers and only inclusive language need to literally construct their own games and worlds. And when their game lacks the viable underlying structure to function even, or when their player base is of a similar mindset to them and demands fully vetted, sensitivity-safe, socially conscious worlds, only such worlds, well, those that build these worlds begin to realize that their hobby is a full-time job, a job so demanding, so colossally warped and manipulated and ever-changing. There aren't even enough hours in the day with which to research and make sure you don't offend one of these overly sensitive zealots. The natural conclusion, after failing to infiltrate isolated and very compartmentalized tabletop communities and after failing to force the creation of these worlds for their own use onto others, the demographic fixated on socially sensitive language, and lore above all else, must produce their own, and quickly realize that the tedium and impossibility of conforming to these ever-shifting expectations rapidly make the hobby untenable, and they begin to come back towards the land of reason, at least I hope, having learned that the endeavor to avoid offending any group of people for any reason at any time when those groups are springing up and disappearing and changing with every passing minute, when that offense is predicated on whatever shifting standard that person randomly comes up with in their mind on any given day, it's not just impossible, it's totally absurd. Effectively, the pendulum has to swing back the other way. I believe it might already be swinging back, actually, because the idea that any interpretation of racial differences in a fantasy world is therefore racist, just because it's different, could not be further from the truth, and turns what should be an escapist hobby with relaxed, nearly whimsical fun into a psychological minefield of social outrage. And when you are the one doing that, well, it's easy to tear down a world that others built because you decided that some of the lore is offensive to you on that day for some manufactured reason. But when you let everyone searching for victimized attention have a voice in that lore, which is what a lot of these people that strive for inclusivity tend to do, it will become very clear, very fast, that you are relegated to telling stories which must be so bland and lacking in all creativity that they might survive the ever-shifting goalpost of sensitivity, for a little while at least, if you get enough sensitivity readers to vet it. But that's it. If you want support, there's links down below. Primarily Odyssey, which is a YouTube platform alternative. It's very rewarding to watch on that platform, so click the link down below and you'll be signed up. Also Locals to support financially if you want to. Another YouTuber to check out, merch, social media, etc., all the YouTube shill stuff. But I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching and have a nice night.